War is built on obedience. Strip away the flags, the anthems, the speeches about honor and sacrifice, and what remains is a single expectation that holds every army together. You follow orders. From the moment a soldier puts on a uniform, obedience becomes instinct. It is drilled into muscle memory, repeated until hesitation disappears. Because hesitation, in battle, can mean death. But history hides an uncomfortable truth. Some orders were never meant to be followed. Orders that violated law. Orders that shattered morality. Orders that turned ordinary men into instruments of atrocity. And yet, they were obeyed. Not by monsters hiding in the shadows, but by soldiers who went home, wrote letters, missed their families, and believed they were doing their duty. This is not a story about evil men. It is a story about the moment obedience becomes a crime, about how authority, fear, and conditioning can override conscience, about commands delivered calmly, efficiently, professionally, commands that should have been refused, and about the lie that has echoed through every war in history. I was just following orders. From ancient battlefields to modern conflicts, that phrase has buried more bodies than any weapon ever built. To understand how this happens, we must begin with the system itself. Armies are not designed to produce moral philosophers. They are designed to produce coordination, discipline, predictability. Training strips away hesitation because hesitation gets people killed. Soldiers are taught to act first and question later, or not at all. This system works until it doesn't. Because once obedience becomes absolute, the conscience becomes optional. History's darkest orders did not arrive screaming. They were not always shouted in rage or madness. Many were delivered in paperwork, briefings, sealed envelopes, and quiet conversations between superiors. They were framed as necessity, as strategy, as survival. And once an order is framed as essential, refusing it becomes almost unthinkable. In ancient times, there were no war crimes tribunals, no international law. Victory itself was morality. Roman legions were ordered to destroy entire cities, to sell survivors into slavery, to salt the earth so nothing would ever grow again. Soldiers who refused were executed alongside the defeated. The Mongol armies carried commands that were brutally simple: surrender and live, resist and disappear. And entire populations were erased not because of individual cruelty, but because obedience demanded it. Colonial empires perfected a more subtle version. Orders to pacify territories often meant burning villages, executing leaders, and terrorizing civilians until resistance collapsed. The language was clean. The reality was not. For centuries, soldiers were never asked whether an order was right, only whether it was given. That changed, briefly, in the 20th century. World War I shattered illusions about honor and war. Industrial killing exposed the cost of blind obedience on a scale humanity had never seen before. When the war ended, there were calls for accountability, for limits, for rules. But accountability failed. Trials were rare, punishments lighter than the crimes they addressed. The message was clear: even if unspoken, obedience would still protect you. And leaders learned from that failure. They learned how to issue criminal orders without writing them down, how to imply rather than command, how to create environments where soldiers understood what was expected without anyone ever saying it aloud. No regime mastered this better than Nazi Germany. The Third Reich did not rely on chaos or brutality alone. It relied on structure, hierarchy, procedure. At the heart of it was the Führerprinzip, the leader principle. Every order flowed downward from one unquestionable authority. Loyalty was not to law or country or humanity. Loyalty was to the leader. Once that principle was accepted, everything else followed. Orders to execute prisoners, orders to eliminate civilians, orders to participate in mass murder. Many of these commands never arrived as explicit instructions. They arrived as expectations. Soldiers were told enemies were subhuman, that mercy was weakness, that hesitation was betrayal, and when the killing began, refusing did not require courage. It required isolation. Because disobedience didn't just mean punishment. It meant standing alone while everyone else complied. Some soldiers refused, most did not. Not because they were sadists, but because the system made obedience easier than resistance. After the war, the world finally tried to draw a line. At Nuremberg, for the first time, following orders was rejected as a defense. The court declared that there are commands so immoral that obeying them is itself a crime. It was a powerful statement, but statements don't stop orders from being given. They only judge what happens afterward, and afterward comes too late for the victims. Decades later in Vietnam, the world watched the same pattern repeat. A village called My Lai. The order was vague. Clear the area. Eliminate threats. Everyone involved understood what that meant. What followed was not chaos, but routine. Civilians lined up, shots fired, silence afterward. Some soldiers refused. One helicopter crew even placed themselves between villagers and American troops, threatening to open fire on their own side to stop the killings. They were the exception. Most obeyed. When the massacre was exposed, responsibility fractured. Officers blamed subordinates. Subordinates blamed officers. The system blamed confusion. Only one man was convicted. The order remained intact. Modern warfare did not eliminate these dilemmas. It buried them under technology. Drone strikes are approved from rooms thousands of miles away. Targets reduced to heat signatures. Civilian deaths reclassified as collateral damage. Special operations follow classified rules of engagement. Black sites exist outside public accountability. Orders are compartmentalized so no one sees the whole picture. Everyone involved knows just enough to do their job, and not enough to question the outcome. And when something goes wrong, responsibility dissolves again. The question remains unchanged. At what point does obedience end and guilt begin? History does not judge soldiers by the difficulty of refusal. It judges by the consequences of compliance. Every generation believes it would refuse the order, that it would be different, that it would stand up when the moment came, but history is written by moments when that belief collapsed. The truth is uncomfortable. The most dangerous orders are not the ones that shock you. They are the ones that sound reasonable, the ones wrapped in duty, in loyalty, in survival, because when the order comes quietly, professionally, legally framed, and socially enforced, refusing it feels like betrayal, and obeying it feels normal. That is how crimes enter history, not screaming, but signed, stamped, and followed. And that is why some orders were never meant to be obeyed. The most disturbing orders in history rarely began with violence. They began with language, words designed to soften reality, to create distance between action and consequence. Neutralize, secure, relocate, process. Each word removed blood from the sentence. Each word made obedience easier. In Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe, mobile killing units known as Einsatzgruppen were given deceptively simple directives. Follow the army, secure the rear, eliminate threats. The word threat was never clearly defined. It didn't need to be. Men, women, children, entire communities were categorized, lined up, and executed beside freshly dug pits. Not in secret, but in daylight. Often with the assistance of local collaborators, sometimes with soldiers who had never fired a weapon in anger before. Reports were written afterward, clean, precise, numbers instead of names. One report recorded over 30,000 deaths in 2 days. No emotion, no hesitation, just confirmation that the order had been carried out. Many of the men involved were not fanatics. They were reservists, teachers, clerks, fathers. Some drank to get through it, some vomited, some requested transfers, but most continued, because stopping would have required confronting a truth more terrifying than death. That obedience had turned them into perpetrators. When asked later why they did it, the answers were almost always the same. Refusal would have meant punishment. Refusal would have meant disgrace. Refusal would have meant standing alone. And so the order moved forward, one man at a time, until mass murder became routine. The pattern did not end in Europe. In imperial Japan, soldiers were trained under an ideology that erased individual life. Surrender was dishonor. Mercy was weakness. Obedience was absolute. Orders were given to execute prisoners, to use civilians for bayonet practice, to conduct medical experiments on living captives. Unit 731 operated with full military approval. Human beings were infected, frozen, dissected without anesthesia. The orders were signed, the chain of command intact. After the war, many of those responsible were never tried. Some were rewarded with immunity in exchange for data. The victims were erased twice, once in life and once in history. In every case, the same defense emerged. I had no choice. But history has proven, again and again, that choice never disappears. It only becomes dangerous. During the Holocaust, there were German officers who refused to carry out execution orders. Some were reassigned. Some were sidelined. Very few were executed. The system relied on fear, but it exaggerated that fear to ensure compliance. The lie was effective. Most soldiers believed refusal meant death. In reality, it meant inconvenience, stigma, or transfer. But by the time that truth became clear, obedience had already done its work. The 20th century was not unique. It was simply better documented. In Latin America, military juntas issued disappearance orders. Suspected dissidents were taken at night, never charged, never seen again. Pilots were ordered to fly drugged prisoners over the ocean and release them mid-air. The ocean erased evidence. The order erased responsibility. In Rwanda, radio broadcasts framed extermination as civic duty. Militias were not commanded at gunpoint. They were encouraged, applauded, normalized. Neighbors killed neighbors because authorities said it was necessary, and because refusing meant being labeled an enemy. The lesson repeated itself relentlessly. When authority defines morality, conscience becomes a liability. Even peacekeeping forces are not immune. In Bosnia, UN troops were ordered to stand down, to observe, to avoid escalation. They watched as thousands were taken away and executed. They followed orders that prioritized neutrality over intervention. Later, the world asked why no one stopped it. The answer was the same. They were following orders. Modern militaries insist these failures belong to the past, that training now emphasizes ethics, that unlawful orders must be refused. On paper, that is true. In reality, modern orders are rarely explicit. They arrive through rules of engagement, through operational pressure, through performance metrics. A drone operator does not hear screams. He sees coordinates. A special forces unit does not receive a command to kill civilians. They receive intelligence assessments and time-sensitive threats. The result is the same. Distance replaces accountability. And when mistakes happen, they are framed as tragic but unavoidable. Collateral damage. The phrase itself is an order disguised as acceptance. It tells soldiers that harm is unfortunate, but expected, necessary. The law insists that unlawful orders must be disobeyed. But law does not stand beside you when the command comes through the radio. Your commander does, your unit does, your fear does. History shows that refusing an order is rarely about bravery in the moment. It is about resisting a system that punishes doubt. The soldiers who refused were not fearless. They were isolated, ostracized, often haunted by what they witnessed rather than what they did. Yet they remain invisible in most war stories. Because refusal does not fit the myth of war, it exposes a truth we prefer not to confront. That obedience is not neutral, it is a choice, one with consequences that echo long after the battle ends. Every war produces orders that cross the line. The line shifts, but it never disappears. And every generation tells itself it would refuse, until the order comes quietly, reasonably, officially, until disobedience feels more dangerous than compliance. And that is when history repeats. Because the most dangerous orders are not illegal on paper. They are illegal in conscience. And conscience, once surrendered, is almost impossible to reclaim. Long after the gunfire ends, the orders remain. They echo in testimony rooms, in court transcripts, in quiet confessions given decades later by men who no longer wear uniforms, but still live with what obedience demanded of them. When war crimes trials begin, they follow a familiar pattern. The accused rarely deny what happened. They deny responsibility. They speak of pressure, of confusion, of fear. They describe a system where disobedience felt unthinkable, even when the order itself felt wrong. At Nuremberg, one defendant after another repeated the same phrase, as if it were a shield. "I was following orders." The judges rejected it. They ruled that there are moments when a human being must choose between command and conscience, and that choosing command does not erase guilt. It was a landmark decision, but it did not change human psychology. Because knowing the law is not the same as resisting authority. Psychologists would later prove what history had already shown. In controlled experiments, ordinary people were willing to inflict severe harm on others when instructed by an authority figure, even when the victim screamed, begged, or fell silent. The presence of authority was enough. The uniform, the title, the certainty, responsibility dissolved upward. The subject no longer felt like the actor. They became the instrument. This mechanism is what turns orders into weapons. Soldiers do not see themselves as choosing to kill. They see themselves as executing a task. That mental shift is not accidental. It is trained. Language is altered to reduce emotional impact. Targets replace people. Objectives replace lives. By the time an unlawful order arrives, the groundwork has already been laid. Refusal feels like malfunction. During the Algerian War, French troops were ordered to use torture as an interrogation method. The orders were unofficial but widely understood. Electric shocks, water suffocation, beatings. Officers insisted it was necessary to save lives, to prevent bombings, to win. Many soldiers complied and later admitted the torture produced little intelligence, but it produced obedience. Those who refused were labeled weak, disloyal, naive. Some were transferred, others were broken psychologically by the isolation. The system did not need to punish everyone. It only needed to make an example of a few. In the Soviet Union, political officers ensured that orders were not questioned. Retreat was treason, mercy was suspicion. Soldiers were sometimes ordered to fire on their own retreating units. Blocking detachments stood behind the lines, rifles ready. The message was clear: obedience or death. But even here, refusal occurred. Men threw weapons aside, missed deliberately, warned others to run. These acts rarely appear in official records. History remembers compliance more easily than resistance. In more recent conflicts, unlawful orders have become more sophisticated. No commander orders commit a war crime. They order speed. They order results. They order dominance. In Iraq, detainee abuse was not the result of chaos. It emerged from an environment where pressure, dehumanization, and ambiguous commands converged. Loosen them up. Make them talk. The words were vague enough to deny later. Those at the bottom absorbed the risk. Those at the top preserved deniability. And when the photos surfaced, accountability stopped where it always does, at the lowest visible level, The soldiers who carried out the acts were punished. The culture that encouraged them was not. This is how unlawful orders survive modern scrutiny. They are fragmented. No single person sees the whole crime. Each individual performs a small part, believing the responsibility lies elsewhere. A signature here, a transmission there, a trigger pulled by someone who never met the victim. When guilt is distributed, no one feels fully responsible. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of systems that reward obedience and punish doubt. Military ethics training emphasizes refusal of illegal orders, but ethics collapse under stress. When exhaustion, fear, loyalty, and survival collide, morality becomes abstract. What remains is the immediate reality. Your commander is watching, your unit is waiting, your future depends on compliance. In that moment, refusing does not feel heroic. It feels reckless. It feels selfish. And so most do what humans have always done under authority. They obey. Years later, many described the same sensation. The moment when they knew the order was wrong, the moment when they acted anyway, the moment when something inside them fractured, quietly, permanently. Some live the rest of their lives defending the order. Others live trying to escape it, but none forget it. The order becomes a ghost, because obedience does not erase memory. It only delays reckoning. History does not ask why it was hard to refuse. It asks why refusal did not happen. And in that question lies the most uncomfortable truth of all, that the line between lawful duty and criminal obedience is not crossed in chaos. It is crossed in calm, in procedure, in silence. And once crossed, it becomes easier to cross again. In the quiet of command centers, far from battlefields, the deadliest orders are issued, not shouted, not dramatic, not written in ink that drips. They arrive as briefings, as intel reports, as approvals signed in a sterile office. Coordinates, timelines, threat assessments, risk calculations. The human cost is filtered through layers of abstraction, and that is the genius of modern unlawful orders. No one feels like they are committing a crime. Everyone feels like they are performing a duty. Drones hover miles above the targets. Operators track heat signatures. Children appear as secondary contacts. Civilians are collateral. At the moment the order is executed, nobody is a killer. They are a professional, a soldier, an instrument of strategy. Yet when the smoke clears, the body counts rise, and the ghosts begin. History does not forgive these invisible moments. It preserves them. Testimonies emerge years later. Confessions whispered in private rooms. Memories too heavy to carry. Special Forces veterans speak of missions where orders were deliberately vague. Kill or capture, sweep or secure, leave no trace. The law required discretion. Ethics required restraint. The order required obedience, and obedience prevailed. The moral injury inflicted in these moments cannot be measured in courtrooms. It cannot be reduced to numbers or reports. It is lived in nightmares, in the sleepless hours, in the quiet moments when the mind replays every choice that should never have been made. Even decades after combat ends, the question lingers. Was refusal possible? And if it was, why didn't I refuse? The human mind prefers obedience. It prefers structure. It prefers the safety of conformity over the chaos of conscience. This is why unlawful orders persist. Not because soldiers are inherently cruel, not because leaders are always sadistic, but because the system transforms ordinary people into instruments of action. And when the system is complete, obedience is no longer a choice. It is a compulsion. The most harrowing examples are not from distant history. They happen quietly in real time, in conflicts that make the headlines briefly before fading from memory. Civilian casualties in urban warfare. Black site interrogations. targeted strikes with questionable intelligence. Every instance carries the same signature, a chain of command that shields itself, ambiguous directives that obscure responsibility, ordinary people who become perpetrators. And every time the world asks the same question, why didn't someone refuse? The answer is terrifyingly simple. Because following the order was easier than refusing. Because obedience is rewarded. Because disobedience is punished, socially, professionally, psychologically. Because in the moment, morality is abstract. The line between right and wrong is blurred by fear, by authority, by the weight of expectation. And history records not the hesitation, but the action. Every soldier who obeys an unlawful order leaves a trace in history, a scar on humanity, a reminder that evil is not always dramatic. It is procedural, it is efficient, it is quiet, and it thrives wherever obedience outweighs conscience. The orders that should never have been followed are still followed. They persist because obedience is the default, and the default is hard to resist. The question that remains for every generation is not whether such orders exist. It is whether, when faced with them, they will obey or refuse. Because history is not written by those who refuse quietly. It is written by those who obey. And the dead remember everything, even when the living forget. Every soldier believes they know what they would do until the order comes. The mind rehearses refusal in theory, courage, conscience, principle. But when the moment arrives, all rehearsals vanish. Fear, loyalty, survival, the weight of expectation, they crush hesitation before it begins. The orders that should never have been followed are followed, and history moves forward as if nothing is amiss. The consequences are measured in lost lives, in broken families, in the invisible scars carried by those who obeyed and those who refused. Even those who refuse are not spared the cost. They become outsiders, witnesses to a world that has chosen compliance over morality. In tribunals, in history books, in quiet recollections decades later, the same truth emerges. Obedience is seductive. It is comfortable. It is easy. And the system will always reward it. Every war, every regime, every conflict produces orders that should never exist. And every generation tells itself it would act differently. But the lesson repeats. The line between duty and crime is crossed in silence. It is crossed in procedure, in paperwork, in routine, in calm professionalism. And once crossed, the consequences ripple through decades. Every drone strike, every forced disappearance, every massacre begins with the same mechanism, an order, and the human tendency to obey it. History leaves us a question, not about the orders themselves, not about who gave them, not even about the victims. It asks us instead, what would you do if the order came to you? Would you obey or would you refuse? The answer defines the thin line between duty and atrocity. It defines whether a soldier remains human or becomes an instrument of history's darkest impulses. Because the dead do not speak loudly. They do not march. They wait in silence. For the living to remember, for the world to ask again, and for someone, somewhere, to refuse the order that should never have been followed. The danger of obedience is not in the act itself. It is in the quiet, the mundane, the ordinary compliance that accumulates until horror is routine. It is in the realization that the order you follow may be the one that history condemns. And by then, it may be too late. History does not forgive those who obey. It only remembers. And the memory is long. The orders were given. The soldiers followed. And humanity is left to reckon with the consequences. The question remains, always, will you obey or refuse?